Good evening and welcome back. Wherever you are tonight, whether the room around you is warm or a little cold, whether it is very late or not nearly late enough, I'm glad you're here. And if you feel like it, you can leave a like, subscribe, or tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. I always like imagining these stories drifting through different windows in different cities, reaching people who are also not sleeping quite as efficiently as they were hoping. But only if you want to. For now, just settle in. Let the day loosen its grip a little. And let us go somewhere that never quite managed to hold still. To a land where the hills did not always belong to the people who farmed them, where the towers on the horizon were not always friendly, where a city might wake beneath one set of rulers and go to sleep wondering about another. A place where people prayed in different languages, bargained in the same market, borrowed each other's habits, distrusted each other thoroughly, and still had to buy bread in the morning, which is, in its own quiet way, how history usually behaves. It rarely arrives wearing polished armor and announcing itself clearly. More often, it comes like a practical inconvenience. A gate that must now close earlier than before. A tax collected by a man with a different accent. A new word for an old street. A church turned into something else. Or a mosque standing beside workshops that do not particularly care who governs, so long as someone keeps the roads open and the wells working. And that, in a place like medieval Spain, was very much the problem. Because roads had to remain open. Wells had to keep working. Olive trees still had to be pruned. Sheep still had to be moved. Grain still had to be carried. Debts still had to be remembered, and city walls still had to be repaired by people who would rather have been doing almost anything else. War, in theory, is dramatic. War, in practice, is often administrative. It is deeply committed to paperwork, anxiety, and poor timing. And for long stretches of the Reconquista, that is what the struggle was really made of. Not only battles and kings and banners, though there were certainly plenty of those, but an endless slow rubbing together of different powers, different faiths, different languages, and different habits of daily life. Not one clean war, not one steady march, but a long, uneven condition. A sort of historical weather. At first, of course, it did not look like 7 or 8 centuries of anything. It rarely does. It looked much smaller. A crossing, a landing, a victory that may have seemed decisive to those involved, but which no one at that first moment could neatly label as the opening movement of nearly 800 years of argument over land, authority, memory, and God. In the early 8th century, Muslim forces crossed into the Iberian Peninsula, and the old Visigothic order gave way with surprising speed. Surprising, at least. If one imagines kingdoms as sturdy things, they are not. Kingdoms are usually held together by agreements, resentments, family arrangements, tax expectations, and the temporary willingness of powerful men not to ruin each other all at once. When that willingness collapses, a kingdom can discover very quickly that its splendid titles and pious ceremonies have not, in fact, made it immortal. So the old order in Iberia gave way, and what followed was not merely conquest in the simple sense, not only the replacement of one army by another, but the beginning of a new pattern of life. A pattern in which rulers changed, but many fields remained in the same place. Villages still clung to rivers. Craftsmen still hammered metal in courtyards. Traders still calculated profit with the same anxious expression found on merchants in every century. This is one of the first things worth lingering over, perhaps longer than seems necessary. Because when people speak too efficiently about long wars between Christians and Muslims in Spain, they can make it sound as though entire populations behaved like neat blocks of colour on a map. One side here, another side there, everyone internally united. Everyone fully aware of the historical significance of the century they happened to be living in, which would have been very convenient. It would also have been nonsense. A city is not a banner. A farmer is not a slogan. And a market town, especially a useful one, has never been all that eager to die for ideological clarity when it could instead remain alive through compromise, complaint, and a little dishonesty. So when Muslim rule spread across much of Iberia, the result was not an emptying of the land and a total replacement of its people, but a more complicated layering. Muslim elites, Arab and Berber influences, local converts, Christians living under Muslim rule, Jewish communities, older local customs that refused to disappear simply because someone in authority wished they would. The result was not purity. The result was mixture. Not peaceful mixture all the time, of course. Not some soft-painted fantasy of eternal harmony beneath orange trees while philosophers exchanged elegant thoughts in sunlit courtyards. That image has been polished rather too lovingly. But mixture, nonetheless. Practical, uneven, suspicious, fruitful mixture. The sort that happens when people live close enough to imitate each other despite themselves. A man may distrust his neighbour's religion and still admire the way his neighbour irrigates a garden. A ruler may condemn another people in public and hire their scribes in private. A victorious power may celebrate conquest while depending immediately on the labour, taxation, and technical habits of the conquered. This happened again and again. And because it happened again and again, the borderlands of Iberia became places where temporary arrangements lasted so long that they began to resemble nature. That is one of the quiet engines of this whole story. Something improvised is introduced because the situation is unstable. Then, the instability continues, so the improvised thing remains. Then, children are born into it. And now, what began as a temporary answer to fear becomes custom. Then law, then memory, then identity. A watchtower goes up because raiders may come. A village organizes night watches because no one trusts the horizon. A local lord offers unusual freedoms because otherwise nobody would settle there. A town allows odd mixtures of language because trade must continue. A ruler leaves an unwanted population in place because there is no one else to work. The mills tend the orchards, clean the irrigation channels, and pay the taxes. All of this is improvised. All of this is temporary. And all of it has the very bad habit of surviving. That was one of the great specialties of the Iberian frontier. Things lingering, things meant only for now becoming things that lasted for generations. If a border region was dangerous, then people had to be persuaded to live there. If people had to be persuaded, they were offered privileges. If privileges were offered, towns began to grow used to them. And once people grow used to an advantage, they develop a touching and very energetic belief that it was granted by divine wisdom and must never be revoked. So, a special legal charter, handed out because a king desperately needed settlers near a vulnerable line of fortresses, might later become a cherished municipal right. A tax exemption meant to lure nervous families into a half-empty district might survive long after the original emergency had faded. A fortified church, an emergency grain store, a pattern of patrol, a district organized around military obligation, all of it could begin in anxiety and end in tradition. This happened on both sides. That is another thing one must not hurry past. The Christians in the north, the Muslims in Al-Andalus, the later Taifa rulers, the North African dynasties, the frontier nobles, the bishops, the judges, the commanders of military orders, the villagers who fled to hilltops when raids came, the merchants who quietly continued trading across cultural lines because profit is an ecumenical force, all of them were forced, in one way or another, to improvise around instability. And improvisation is not elegant. It is patchwork. It is a bucket under a leaking roof. It is a legal exception renewed one more year because no one can think of a better answer. It is a governor keeping a local custom he dislikes because abolishing it would cause trouble. It is a ruler publicly praising unity while privately negotiating with rivals who are supposedly the wrong religion. And here the story becomes delightfully untidy. Because the Reconquista, if one stares at it too quickly, appears as a clean struggle between Christian North and Muslim South. But the longer one looks, the more the edges blur. Muslim rulers allied with Christian rulers against Muslim rivals. Christian kings accepted tribute from Muslim Taifa states and did very well out of it. Cities changed hands without instantly changing. Character. People stayed. People adapted. People converted. People pretended. People learned just enough of another language to sell wool or settle a dispute or avoid being cheated quite so badly. And in the middle of all this, life continued with its usual stubborn bad manners. Children were born during sieges. Vineyards had to be pruned after political collapse. A blacksmith still needed charcoal, whether the tax collector said his prayers in Latin or Arabic. There is something almost rude about ordinary life in times of great historical transformation. It simply refuses to behave with proper drama. Even in periods of conquest, daily life is full of repetitive annoyances. Water must be carried, bread burns, animals wander off, officials become tiresome, neighbours remember insults, debts remain inconveniently alive after dynasties fall. In fact, one of the best ways to understand the long wars in Iberia is to stop thinking first about kings and instead think about doors. Doors are useful. A city gate, for example, tells you whether people feel safe. If the frontier is unsettled, the gates close earlier. Someone checks the hinges. Someone watches the road. A man approaching at dusk is no longer merely late. He is potentially a problem. Doors inside houses matter too. What do families store close at hand if violence may come quickly? What gets packed first? Which room is safest? Where documents are kept? Whether valuables are hidden in walls or floors? Whether animals are brought nearer to the house at night? These are not heroic details, which is precisely why they matter. A long frontier war reshapes habit before it reshapes legend. And once habit changes, the mind follows. People begin to live as though uncertainty is normal. They build for it. They speak for it. They pray for it. They joke about it dryly, because humour is often what remains when control has become theoretical. One can imagine, across these long centuries, 1,000 conversations that were never written down. Will they raid this year? Probably. Will the king help? Probably not. Should we repair the wall? We repaired it last year, and yet here we are. Should we leave? To go where? Which is usually the best question in history. To go where? The Christians who held out in the northern mountains did not begin as a smooth machine of reconquest. They were small powers, fractured powers, local powers, often more interested in surviving than in fulfilling some grand destiny that later chroniclers would kindly assign to them. And yet surviving has a way of becoming ideology after enough generations. A little mountain refuge can, with time, become the cradle of restoration. A local resistance can become the sacred memory of a nation. A hard winter in a rough northern valley can become the first chapter of a triumphal story written centuries later by men seated comfortably indoors. This is not to say the struggle was invented. Far from it. Only that memory does what memory always does. It straightens crooked paths. It gives purpose to muddle. It takes a long series of immediate practical decisions and turns them into a grand continuous mission. Reality, meanwhile, remains less disciplined. A northern ruler might dream of recovering lost lands and also spend an alarming amount of time fighting fellow Christians. A Muslim ruler in Al-Andalus might defend Islam and also calculate whether paying tribute to a Christian king would be cheaper than losing a city. A frontier town might define itself by faith and still depend on artisans from the other community. This sort of contradiction was not a side effect. It was the structure, and nowhere was that clearer than in the cities. A city in medieval Iberia was not just a place where one population lived under one identity. It could be layered, multilingual, suspicious, collaborative, commercially energetic, and full of legal peculiarities no one had entirely intended to preserve. There were Christians under Muslim rule, often called Mozarabs, who adopted Arabic language and aspects of Arabized urban culture while keeping their religion. There were Jews who navigated changing regimes with varying degrees of vulnerability and opportunity. There were Muslims who later remained under Christian rule, becoming what historians call mudajars, still farming, crafting, paying, negotiating, enduring. And every one of these arrangements had something provisional about it. That is what makes them so fascinating. They were rarely designed as timeless ideals. More often, they were tolerated because immediate. Replacement was impossible. You conquer a city and discover, with some irritation, that the people who know how to manage the irrigation system are not the people you had hoped would be in charge. You take over a district and realize the tax records are in a language half your officials cannot read. You celebrate a victory and then learn that without the labor of the defeated population, the workshops stop, the markets shrink, and the revenue upon which your triumph depends becomes sadly theoretical. So people stayed. Treaties were made. Exceptions multiplied. Special statuses emerged. Temporary coexistence took root, not because everyone had achieved enlightenment, but because administration is a humbling experience. And this is perhaps one of the quiet jokes at the heart of the Reconquista. Many of the people who imagined themselves purifying or restoring a land spent generations managing, compromise instead. Not because they wanted to, because they had to. Purity is expensive. Governance is compromise with better robes. The frontier, then, was never simply a line. It was a broad, unsettled belt of hill forts, market roads, river valleys, half-recovered districts, abandoned farms, resettled villages, uneasy garrisons, and towns trying very hard to appear more stable than they really were. And the people who lived there grew used to life being conditional. That field is ours if no raid comes. That charter protects us if the king remembers. That alliance holds if tribute continues. That peace lasts if nobody ambitious inherits the throne. This is not the kind of existence that produces clean narratives. It produces habits. It produces wary people. It produces a culture of repair. Repair the wall. Repair the alliance. Repair the canal. Repair the tax register. Repair the church roof after a season of neglect. Repair yesterday's emergency until it becomes tomorrow's institution. And once one notices that pattern, one begins to see it everywhere in Iberia. The border is not fixed, so watchfulness becomes normal. The population is mixed, so translation becomes normal. The rulers change, so adaptation becomes normal. The danger returns, so memory becomes practical rather than ceremonial. And all the while, above the towers and orchards and roads and stony uplands, history keeps pretending it is about grand destiny, when, very often, it is about who can keep enough people in a dangerous place long enough to make a town survive. Not glorious, perhaps, but then survival seldom is. And still, over time, these practical arrangements hardened. A temporary garrison became a permanent fortress town. An emergency privilege became inherited right. A mixed-language marketplace became ordinary. A district settled for defence became a community with pride, grievance, and a local identity sharp enough to outlast the original reason for its existence. This is how centuries pass without noticing. Not as one long trumpet blast, but as repeated adjustments to inconvenience, a little fear, a little opportunity, a little greed, a little faith, a great deal of patience. And so, the land learned to breathe through instability, to expand, contract, and hold itself together through makeshift habits that were never supposed to last. Which, of course, meant they lasted beautifully. For a while longer, then, the old cities remained crowded with layered memory, and the frontier kept moving without ever truly leaving. Kings rose and fell. Dynasties argued. Soldiers marched. Clerics wrote. But underneath it, all the roads, walls, fields, and neighbourhoods were already being trained into a long endurance. Not peace, not war exactly. Something in between. Something that could go on for a very long time. And it did. There is a strange stubbornness to cities. A kingdom may collapse with a surprising lack of dignity. A dynasty may spend years announcing its authority and then vanish into argument, betrayal, or defeat. Armies may arrive with banners, prayers, and very high opinions of themselves. But a city, when it is old enough, often reacts with a kind of weary practicality. Very well, it seems to say. If you are the new masters, then who will repair the bridge? Who will keep grain moving through the market? Who will settle the dispute over 3 donkeys, one shared well, and an olive grove that everyone claims belonged to their grandfather? This is not heroic material, which is one reason it lasts. And in the long centuries of the Reconquista, cities lasted by being more patient than the people who ruled them. In the north, the Christian realms were small at first, uneven, often poor, pressed into mountains and rougher land, carrying with them not only ambition, but memory. Memory is useful in politics. It can be polished, enlarged, sanctified, and made to do heavy lifting. A little survival in the hills can, after enough time, be made to resemble destiny, which must have been very satisfying for the chroniclers, less satisfying, perhaps, for the people actually living in those northern lands, where winter was cold, roads were bad, labour was hard, and the future remained irritatingly uncertain. Still, small things endure. A court in a mountain kingdom, a church preserving older rites, a noble family insisting its lineage matters, a valley defended one more season, a fort rebuilt not because anyone believes in grand history, but because if it is not rebuilt, men on horses may come through the pass and take what they like. These are unimpressive beginnings, which is usually how durable things begin. To the south, meanwhile, Al-Andalus became something much richer, more urban, and more layered than the crude idea of simple conquest would suggest. There were rulers, yes, and armies, yes, and struggles among Arab and Berber elites, and rebellions, and fragile arrangements. But there were also cities that mattered because they contained more than power. They contained skill, and skill has its own authority. A city like Córdoba did not become remarkable because soldiers liked it. Soldiers, like many places briefly, and ruined them with equal enthusiasm. Córdoba mattered because it gathered administration, scholarship, craft, trade, agriculture, water management, and habit into one place until that place became more than a capital. It became a machine for urban life. That machine was not simple. Nothing in Iberia was simple for very long. There were Arab elites and Berber populations, and local converts, and Christians living under Muslim rule, and Jews, active in commerce, scholarship, and administration. There were linguistic layers, social layers, tax layers, legal layers. There were communities living near one another, sometimes peacefully, sometimes resentfully, often both within the same week. A man might buy cloth from someone whose theology he found appalling. A judge might rely on the records of a clerk whose grandfather had served under different rulers. A bishop might complain bitterly about Muslim authority while quietly using administrative habits shaped by that very authority. A ruler might present himself as the guardian of divine order while depending on taxes collected through compromise, exemptions, and special arrangements no one considered ideal. This is worth sitting with, because there is a temptation, especially in stories about religious frontier, to imagine that people lived in a constant state of clean opposition, as though each morning they woke, checked which civilization they belonged to, and acted accordingly. But people are usually much more disorderly than that. They wake because there is noise in the street, because someone is already moving barrels, because a child is crying, because a cartwheel has broken, because the call to prayer rises over roofs, because church bells sound, because both sounds exist in memory depending on the city, the district, the generation, and the arrangement currently being tolerated by officials. And then the day begins, with all the practical demands that do not disappear simply because theology exists. Bread must be baked, and bread has never cared very much about ideology. It cares about flour, heat, timing, fuel, and whether someone has stolen part of the grain shipment. Water must be carried. Accounts must be checked. Animals must be fed. If there is an irrigation channel, it must be kept clear. If there is a tax, it must be argued over. If there is a wall, it must be maintained, because every government loves walls in theory and prefers someone else to pay for them in practice. In that sense, a city is always teaching its rulers humility, or trying to. Some rulers remain unteachable, but the lesson is there. Take Toledo, for instance, though not too quickly. Toledo is the sort of city that embarrasses simple narratives merely by existing. It had older roots, older prestige, older memories. It mattered before Muslim rule, mattered under Muslim rule, and continued to matter after Christian conquest, which is inconvenient if one wishes to tell history as a neat story of replacement. Replacement is rarely neat. What happens more often is accumulation. A city gathers one layer over another. New rulers arrive. Older populations remain. Sacred spaces change hands, or function changes around them. Language shifts unevenly. Law reaches one district before another. Custom survives in corners. People learn which official can be bribed, which market day is safest, which routes to avoid at dusk, which words to use depending on who is listening. It is all very civilized in the least glamorous sense, by which I mean it is complicated, repetitive, and full of people trying to avoid unnecessary losses. This was true not only in Toledo, but in many Iberian cities touched by the long frontier. Zaragoza, Seville, Valencia, Granada later on. Places with walls, gates, markets, neighbourhoods, workshops, gardens, legal peculiarities, and populations who could not be neatly folded into a single identity, even when rulers very much wished they could. There is an administrative melancholy to all this. You conquer a city expecting triumph and discover filing problems. The revenue records are incomplete. The irrigation system depends on specialists you do not trust. The local population knows 20 practical things your soldiers do not. The artisans who carve wood, fire ceramics, shape metal, or manage urban water are still the same people they were yesterday. And yesterday, inconveniently, they belonged to the enemy. So what now? What now, indeed? Usually, what now meant toleration in some form, whether generous, grudging, strategic, or temporary. Christians living under Muslim rule had status. Not equal status, certainly, but recognized status. Jews, likewise. Taxes differed. Legal standing differed. Prestige differed. But life continued through these layered inequalities. This is one reason the cities of Iberia were so alive and so tense at the same time. Difference was not hidden. Difference was organized, managed, taxed, noticed, written into the rhythms of the city. And because it was managed rather than erased, it seeped into everything. Into speech, into clothing, into architecture, into food, into habits of trade, into the very shape of streets and domestic courtyards. People borrowed because they were near each other. Sometimes because borrowing was useful. Sometimes because beauty is difficult to resist, even when one disapproves of its source. Sometimes because the best available craftsmen belonged to the wrong religion, which is unfortunate for zealots, but helpful for anyone who wants a beautiful ceiling. There is a quiet comedy here as well. Cultures that define themselves against each other are forever stealing each other's practical advantages. A man may denounce his enemies and then adopt their irrigation methods. A victorious court may celebrate the defeat of Muslim power while preserving Muslim artisans, Muslim agricultural systems, Arabic loanwords, and decorative forms clearly descended from the very society it claims to have overcome. History is not above hypocrisy. It is built out of it, and city life encourages that kind of selective consistency. If a system works, people keep it. They may rename it, bless it differently, assign it to a new authority, pretend it is theirs by ancient right, but they keep it. This, too, is part of the Reconquista that benefits from being left to linger, because the struggle was not only over land. It was over inherited usefulness, over roads, mills, orchards, river access, fortified heights, tax bases, ports, skilled labour, and cities that had already learned how to function at a high level of complexity. A conquering power did not simply take symbolic possession. It inherited headaches, which, in a mature society, are often more valuable than glory. Consider the ordinary street, not a palace, not a fortress, just a street in a substantial Iberian city. Perhaps it is narrow, perhaps it bends, perhaps the buildings crowd one another for shade and security. Perhaps there are workshops opening toward the lane, and smells rising that no one in any century would call poetic. Leather, smoke, oil, wet stone, animals, bread, human density, a little sewage, a little spice. Too much dust when the season is dry, too much mud when the rain has been unkind. Now add languages, add accents, add inherited suspicion, add the knowledge that political authority may change within a lifetime. Add priests, rabbis, qadis, merchants, soldiers, widows, apprentices, scribes, children, porters, visitors, beggars, and officials moving through overlapping systems of power. This is not coexistence in the lazy, sentimental sense. This is coexistence as crowding, as friction, as dependence, as proximity without innocence. And it could last a very long time. The Christians under Muslim rule, those later called Mozarabs, are a good example of how the city changes people even when faith does not. They remained Christian, but many became Arabized in language and aspects of culture. Because how could one live within a dominant urban civilization and not absorb it, especially if one wished to work, trade, negotiate, survive, or simply avoid appearing foolish in public? Language, after all, is not always a matter of loyalty. Often, it is a matter of getting things done. You want to buy, you want to sell, you want to petition, you want to argue, you want to read what the authorities have written about. Your obligations, which is generally wise if the authorities are enthusiastic about collecting them. So, language travels, dress travels, taste travels, even humor travels. Quietly. And yet these borrowings did not dissolve difference. They made difference stranger. A Christian who speaks Arabic. A Muslim official using local practices inherited from older traditions. A Jewish scholar moving between intellectual worlds. A city where sacred and legal distinctions remain firm, but daily habits leak across them constantly. This is not tidy material, and that is precisely why it is useful, because it gives the narrative texture. And the more one looks, the more one sees that temporary arrangement becoming structure. A separate status for a community begins as a practical method of rule. Then it persists. A negotiated tax regime begins as an expedient. Then generations grow up inside it. A tolerated district begins as necessity. Then it acquires memory, grievances, habits, architecture, and its own sense of itself. One can almost feel this happening in slow motion. A ruler says, "For now, let them remain. For now, let them worship. For now, let them keep their judges in certain matters. For now, let them farm these lands, maintain these canals, manage these workshops." And then now becomes 20 years, then 50, then longer. And what was temporary becomes ordinary. Not because anyone planned so well, because no one found a workable substitute. This happened under Muslim rule. It would happen under Christian rule too. The great frontier did not destroy mixture. It reorganized it, sometimes violently, sometimes efficiently, sometimes hypocritically, often all three. And there were always those who wanted cleaner lines, people who disliked ambiguity, people who preferred a world sorted into obvious categories: clerics, ideologues, reformers, stern men of order, severe dreamers of purified society. Every age produces them, and they are usually exhausting. But real cities are hard to purify. Too many dependencies, too many records, too many people who know where the money actually comes from. Too many tasks only certain hands know how to do. A canal does not maintain itself because a preacher has spoken well. A market does not remain supplied because a king has noble intentions. Someone must still carry, build, count, mend, bargain, sweep, transport, write, watch, and endure. That endurance is one of the true foundations of Iberian history in this period. Not simply military endurance, though that mattered. Urban endurance, civic endurance, the ability of a city to survive the ambitions of those who wanted to possess it. That survival, however, came at a cost. The very systems that allowed mixed cities to function also froze distinctions in place. Legal categories, tax burdens, religious separation, access to office, dress codes in some times and places, limits, privileges, exclusions, tolerations, humiliations. One group may remain because it is useful, but usefulness is not equality. A tolerated population is not a secure one. A protected community is protected only until policy changes, or fear rises, or a new ruler decides to be remembered for firmness rather than patience. So there is always a nervousness beneath the city's pragmatism. The market opens, the market functions. But everyone remembers that regimes shift, that treaties can be revised, that toleration can sour, that yesterday's practical necessity can become tomorrow's political scandal. This is one reason memory in these cities must have had such a peculiar shape. Not memory as grand national story, memory as neighborhood instinct. Which gate feels unsafe? Which quarter is watched more closely? Which official can be approached? Which feast days make the streets louder? Which families remained after the last change in power? Which left? Which converted? Which are suspected of pretending? Which wells run low in bad summers? Which roads are best avoided when troops are nearby? That is the texture of long tension. Not constant battle, constant adjustment. And in these cities, adjustment could become culture. A man learns to speak differently in different spaces. A household keeps objects inherited from one world and habits from another. A building carries forms older than the regime that claims it. A neighborhood develops a reputation based on events no one fully remembers, but everyone still obeys. A child grows up thinking these arrangements are natural, even though they were built from yesterday's compromise. And then that child becomes an old man, defending those same arrangements as sacred custom. This is how temporary things become permanent. Not with ceremony, with repetition. And repetition is one of history's least glamorous but most effective tools. Do something because it is necessary. Do it again because the problem remains. Teach it to the next generation because that is how things are done. Soon nobody can remember when it started. Then some learned man writes a justification for it. Then a ruler claims to defend it. And now the improvised answer has become part of the world. There is something almost touching in that. Also something slightly absurd. A great many solemn traditions begin as frightened solutions to unpleasant circumstances. The frontier was full of these. So were the cities. Especially the cities. Because a city cannot remain theoretical for long. It must eat, it must drain, it must collect, it must punish, it must forgive just enough to go on. And so, even when war framed the horizon, daily urban life kept weaving connections people were not always willing to admit. A merchant crossing linguistic boundaries for profit, an artisan carrying techniques from one patronage system into another, a Christian ruler preserving a Muslim tax mechanism because it works, a Muslim administration relying on local precedents older than its own arrival. These things did not end conflict. They made conflict intimate. The enemy was not always somewhere else. Often he lived in the next district, built the house beside yours, supplied the market, wrote the documents, repaired the harness, rented the shop, or shared the same city wall when outsiders attacked. And that is another delicious inconvenience for anyone hoping for a simple tale. Because when danger comes from outside, people inside a city may discover that coexistence becomes briefly practical in a more urgent way. You may dislike your neighbor's faith, and still need him on the wall at midnight. You may resent his tax privileges and still need his knowledge of the cistern system. You may preach separation and still rely on his labor in harvest season. This did not produce harmony, but it did produce entanglement. And entanglement, once formed, is very hard to cut cleanly. That is why cities like Toledo matter so much in the long history of Iberia. Not because they were calm, because they were durable, because they absorbed conquest and remained useful, because they forced rulers into compromise with reality, because they held layer after layer of belief, memory, and practical need in one place until everyone involved had to live with contradiction, however much they may have preferred not to. And contradiction, in medieval Spain, was not a flaw in the story. It was the story. For now then, let the cities remain where they are, breathing through stone and dust, half governed by law, half by custom, and entirely by the fact that tomorrow morning somebody will still need bread. And bread, as ever, is less interested in ideology than in whether the oven is hot, the grain has arrived, and the wall is still standing. There is a moment in long conflicts when something quietly breaks, not in the dramatic sense. No great collapse, no thunder, no single battle that explains everything afterward. Just a subtle shift in how people behave. A realization, perhaps, that the world is not arranging itself into two clean sides, that it never intended to, that survival might require doing things that feel inconvenient. To explain later. In Iberia, one of those moments arrived when unity gave way to fragmentation. The great structure of Muslim rule, which had once held large parts of the peninsula together under a single authority, loosened, strained, and then almost reluctantly fell apart into smaller pieces. Not into chaos, exactly, but into something more delicate, more unstable, more negotiable. Cities and regions that had once belonged to a larger whole began to stand on their own, or tried to. Little courts appeared. Local rulers declared authority. Ambition multiplied. So did anxiety. Because independence sounds impressive, until one realizes it also means being alone when trouble arrives. And trouble, in this part of the world, had a way of arriving quite regularly. These smaller states, these fragmented powers, are often remembered as taifa kingdoms, though kingdom is perhaps a generous word in some cases. They were political islands, some wealthy, some fragile, some ambitious beyond reason, some aware with painful clarity that they could not survive without help. And help, as it turned out, was available. Just not always from the direction one might expect. Here is where the story becomes particularly uncomfortable, because when one imagines a long religious struggle, one tends to assume that enemies remain enemies, that lines are clear, that alliances follow belief, that a ruler confronted with danger would naturally turn toward those who share his faith, which is a very clean assumption, and almost entirely wrong. Because what happens when your greatest threat is not the distant opponent, but your neighbor? The man whose city lies just beyond your border. The ruler whose ambitions resemble your own a little too closely. The rival who understands your weaknesses because he shares your culture, your language, your habits of rule. This is a deeply inconvenient problem, and it has a deeply inconvenient solution. You look elsewhere. You look even to your enemy. So, a Muslim ruler, threatened by another Muslim ruler, might send envoys north to a Christian king, and not to fight him, but to ask for protection, or assistance, or at the very least, restraint. It is an arrangement that would not sound particularly noble when explained in a sermon. But it made sense. Because survival, as we have already noticed, tends to be practical. And so began one of the most quietly fascinating habits of the Reconquista: paying the enemy, regularly, almost politely, a system known as tribute, or, in some contexts, parias, which is a word that carries a certain dry weight to it, as though it knows it will not be celebrated in epic poetry. A Taifa ruler would agree to send money, goods, or other forms of wealth to a Christian king. In return, that king might agree not to attack, or might agree to attack someone else, or might simply enjoy the income while considering his options. It was, in many ways, a perfectly reasonable arrangement, and also, in the long term, a disastrous one. Because money moves, money accumulates, money strengthens, and the Christian kingdoms of the north, which had once been smaller, poorer, and more constrained, began to receive a steady flow of wealth from the very lands they might one day wish to conquer. There is something almost elegant in that irony. A ruler, trying to buy peace for today, funds the strength of his opponent tomorrow. A temporary solution, becoming permanent, or at least lasting long enough to shape the future in ways no one intended. The tribute must be collected, so taxes increase, or are reorganized, or enforced more aggressively, which causes resentment, which weakens internal stability, which makes the ruler more dependent on the very external support he was trying to avoid, which leads to more tribute, which leads to more dependence. It is a circle, not a comfortable one, but a persistent one. And it was not only about money. These arrangements created habits, expectations. Christian king begins to see tribute not as an exception, but as income, a normal part of his resources, something to be relied upon, planned for, perhaps even demanded, which means that when tribute stops, it feels less like diplomacy and more like theft, which, naturally, invites a response. And so the relationship between these powers becomes something stranger than simple war. Not peace, not alliance, something in between, a state of negotiated hostility, which, if one listens closely, sounds very much like the broader condition of the Iberian frontier itself, unresolved, adjustable, full of agreements that are not entirely trusted. Now consider what this does to the people living under these rulers, because they are, as always, the ones carrying the weight of these clever arrangements. A farmer does not pay tribute to a distant Christian king directly. He pays taxes to his local ruler, who pays tribute to someone else. So the chain of obligations stretches and stretches and stretches until it reaches someone who has never seen the field where the grain was grown. And the farmer, meanwhile, notices only that the demands have increased, that officials are more insistent, that explanations are less satisfying, that the reasons given for payment are not particularly reassuring. It is one thing to pay taxes for your own ruler. It is another to discover that part of that payment travels elsewhere, to a power that may, at some point, decide to invade anyway, which is, if nothing else, an irritating arrangement. But irritation does not stop systems. It feeds them, because once tribute becomes embedded, removing it is difficult. The receiving side becomes accustomed to it. The paying side becomes structured around it. The administrators who manage it develop expertise, positions, expectations. And now what began as a temporary measure to avoid disaster becomes part of the political landscape. Another layer, another habit, another thing that no one quite intended to last. And yet it does. Of course, tribute was not the only form of creative cooperation. There were also alliances, more direct ones, the sort that make later historians shift in their chairs slightly, because they do not fit the narrative as comfortably as one might like. A Christian ruler might ally with a Muslim ruler against another Christian. A Muslim ruler might invite Christian forces to help settle a local conflict. Mercenaries could cross boundaries. Loyalties could be negotiated. Faith remained important, but it did not eliminate calculation. If anything, it made calculation more complicated, because now one had to consider not only advantage, but justification, not only survival, but explanation. How does one explain to one's subjects that assistance has been sought from those who are meant to be opposed, carefully, or not at all, or with enough confidence that explanation becomes unnecessary? Power has its own language, and people, for the most part, prefer stability to clarity. If the fields are not burned, if the city is not besieged, if trade continues, then perhaps certain uncomfortable facts can be overlooked, at least for a while. This is how contradictions survive, not by being resolved, but by being endured. The Taifa period, then, is not simply a story of weakness. Though weakness is certainly present, it is also a story of multiplication. More rulers, more courts, more negotiations, more opportunities for cleverness, more chances for miscalculation, more ways for temporary solutions to settle into place. Each Taifa must decide whom to fear most, whom to pay, whom to fight, whom to flatter, whom to ignore. And none of these decisions remain stable for very long, because neighbours change, alliances shift, fortunes rise and fall. A city that paid tribute last year may refuse this year. A king who accepted payment last year may demand more this year. A ruler who seemed secure may discover, abruptly, that his position was based on assumptions rather than strength. And then everything must be negotiated again. There is something almost exhausting about this world, endlessly adjusting, endlessly recalculating, endlessly trying to remain just stable enough to continue. And in the middle of all this, life continues. Markets open, children grow, buildings age, roads wear down, water systems need repair, officials argue over jurisdiction, clerics argue over doctrine, merchants argue over price. Neighbours argue over everything else, and somewhere always, someone is trying to work out whether paying the enemy again this year might be the sensible thing to do. Not admirable, not heroic, but sensible, at least until it isn't. And this is where the long war begins to change its shape, because there is a limit to how long fragmentation can sustain itself, a limit to how long wealth can flow in one direction without consequences, a limit to how long temporary arrangements can hold, before something larger decides to intervene. And intervention, when it comes, rarely asks permission. Sometimes it arrives from the north, sometimes from across the sea, sometimes from within. And when it does, all these careful, improvised, practical systems begin to strain, which is unfortunate because people had just gotten used to them. There is a particular kind of decision that feels very wise at the time. It is usually made under pressure. There is a threat. There is not enough strength to face it alone. There is urgency and a certain amount of fear, though no one involved will use that word in official correspondence. And so someone says, quite reasonably, "We need help. Not forever, just for now, just enough to restore balance, just enough to survive this moment." And that is how outside powers are invited in, which is, historically speaking, one of the most reliable ways to create new problems, because help rarely travels lightly. It arrives with expectations, with structure, with its own understanding of how things should be arranged, and, occasionally, with the quiet belief that if it has done the work of saving a situation, it might as well remain in charge of it. This is not always stated directly. It does not have to be. Reality tends to explain it soon enough. In Iberia, as the Taifa kingdoms found themselves increasingly unable to manage both their internal rivalries and the growing pressure from the north, they looked across the narrow stretch of sea to North Africa. And there they found strength. Disciplined, organized, motivated, and, importantly, not yet entangled in the delicate, exhausting web of Iberian politics. At least, not yet. So the invitation was made. Come, help us, restore order, push back the advance, and, perhaps, quietly implied, do not ask too many questions about how things have been managed so far. This was, on the surface, entirely sensible. The Taifa rulers needed reinforcement. The northern Christian kingdoms were growing stronger, richer, more confident. The flow of tribute had shifted the balance. Something had to be done. And so the Almoravids came. And at first, they did exactly what they were supposed to do. They fought. They resisted. They provided the kind of military solidity that the fragmented Taifa world lacked. For a moment, the arrangement seemed to work, which is always the most dangerous phase of any temporary solution, because success encourages continuation, encourages trust, encourages the quiet belief that this, perhaps, could be stable. But stability, when borrowed, comes at a price. The Almoravids were not merely soldiers. They were a movement, a disciplined force with its own vision of order, its own expectations of governance, its own sense of how things should be done. And Iberia, with its layered compromises, its flexible arrangements, its negotiated coexistence, its comfortable inconsistencies, must have seemed untidy, possibly even unacceptable. And so, gradually, almost inevitably, help became authority. Not all at once. That would have been too obvious, too abrupt, too easy to resist. Instead, it unfolded the way these things often do. A little more influence here, a little more control there, a decision justified by necessity, a replacement justified by efficiency, a correction justified by principle. And before long, the Almoravids were not simply assisting the Taifa rulers, they were replacing them, which is, again, a familiar pattern. Invite someone to solve your problem. Discover that you have become part of theirs. This is not to say the transition was smooth. It rarely is. Local elites resist. Populations adjust, unevenly. Old habits persist in corners. New rules are enforced with varying degrees of enthusiasm. But over time, a new structure settles. More centralized, more rigid, less tolerant of the kind of improvisation that had defined the Taifa period. And here we encounter another one of those quiet transformations. Because the earlier system, for all its weakness, had allowed a certain flexibility, a certain negotiation. Cities had managed their differences. Rulers had balanced competing pressures. Communities had found ways, however imperfect, to coexist within a shifting framework. Now, the framework itself began to harden, and hardness has consequences. It can create strength, it can also create resistance, because people who have grown used to a certain degree of local control, a certain set of privileges, a certain rhythm of life, do not always welcome a more disciplined, more uniform authority, even if that authority is more effective in war, especially if it is more effective in war, because effectiveness often demands sacrifice, and sacrifice is rarely popular when it arrives in someone else's plan. Still, for a time, the system held. The northern advance slowed, the balance shifted. And one might have imagined, if one were inclined toward optimism, that this new order would stabilize the peninsula. But optimism, as we have already seen, is not particularly well suited to this story, because what happens once tends to happen again. Structures rise, structures strain, structures change. The Almoravids themselves would eventually face challenges from within, from without, from the same forces that had shaped the pass. Earlier fragmentation. And once again, the solution would come from across the water. The Almohads. Another movement. Another reform. Another attempt to impose clarity on a world that had grown used to ambiguity. Another arrival. Another promise of strength. Another layer added to an already complex landscape. And once again, the pattern repeats. Help arrives. Help succeeds. Help settles. Help becomes authority. Authority becomes expectation. Expectation becomes structure. Structure becomes normal, until it no longer works and must be replaced. There is something almost rhythmic about it, a tide, perhaps, coming in, going out, each wave leaving behind a different arrangement of sand, stone, and debris. And the people living along the shore, adjusting each time, building again, repairing again, learning once more how to survive within whatever new pattern has been imposed upon them. Meanwhile, To the north, something quieter but no less important was happening. The Christian kingdoms were changing too. They were not simply waiting, they were growing, learning, adapting. The wealth from tribute had not vanished. It had been used, invested, turned into armies, into administration, into confidence, into the slow realization that what had once been survival might become expansion, which is, again, a dangerous realization, because expansion requires more than victory. It requires holding, managing, settling, administering, all the things that make conquest less romantic and more complicated. But that moment had not fully arrived yet, for now there was still resistance, still pressure, still a sense that the South was strong, organized, and capable of pushing back. And so the frontier held, or seemed to, which is often the same thing for a while. But beneath that appearance, pressures were building. Systems were stretching. Temporary solutions were becoming permanent structures. And permanent structures were beginning to show their limits. The kind of limits that do not announce themselves immediately. They appear first as inconvenience, then as irritation, then as instability, and, finally, as change, which, when it comes, always feels both sudden and long overdue. And in the cities, life continued. Because it always does. Under Almoravid rule, under Almohad rule, under whatever authority claimed the walls and the gates. People adapted. They always do. A craftsman learns new. Expectations. A merchant adjusts his routes. A family negotiates its place. A community redefines its boundaries. And, all the while, the memory of earlier arrangements lingers, of looser systems, of negotiated coexistence, of flexibility. Memory does not disappear simply because policy changes. It waits, and sometimes it returns. Because people remember what worked, and what, at least, allowed them to live with fewer interruptions. So even as new powers tried to impose order, the old habits of adaptation did not vanish. They simply moved, changed shape, found new ways to survive. Which is, perhaps, the most consistent trait of this entire story. Not conquest, not faith, not even conflict, adaptation, relentless, unfinished, always adjusting to whatever new version of temporary has just arrived, and is already beginning, quietly, to become permanent. There is a certain kind of story people like to tell about wars. It usually involves a moment, a single turning point, a battle that changes everything. Before it, uncertainty. After it, clarity. Before it, struggle. After it, inevitable victory. It is a very satisfying structure. It is also, more often than not, misleading, because even when something truly important happens, even when a battle is significant, even when it shifts the balance in ways that are difficult to ignore, the world does not politely reorganize itself overnight. People do not wake the next morning and say, "Ah, yes, everything is different now." They wake up and ask whether the bread is still available, whether the road is safe, whether the tax collector has become more or less reasonable. History may declare a turning point. Life tends to continue arguing with it. And so, when we arrive at the early 13th century, and at the battle that later generations would treat as a decisive moment, It is worth resisting the temptation to move too quickly. Because the battle itself, Las Navas de Tolosa, fought in 1212, was indeed important. But importance is not the same as immediacy. The forces gathered, alliances formed. Christian rulers, who did not always agree, found reasons, for a time, to cooperate, because sometimes the pressure becomes large enough that disagreement feels like a luxury, and sometimes it does not. But in this case, cooperation happened, which is, in itself, something of a minor miracle in medieval politics. Armies moved south, which is never a simple matter. Moving an army is not merely marching, it is feeding, watering, coordinating, arguing, waiting, repairing, losing patience, finding it again, getting lost, finding the road again, and all of this before a single blow is struck. Then, there is the terrain. Always the terrain. Hills, passes, routes that must be found or avoided. Paths that may be blocked. Paths that may be revealed by someone who knows them. Often quietly. Often without much ceremony. And so the armies meet. The battle is fought. It is fierce. It matters. And the Almohad forces are defeated. This is, in the language of history, a turning point. But what does that mean, really? Does it mean the war is over? No. Does it mean cities immediately fall? No. Does it mean the landscape transforms overnight? Not at all. What it means is something subtler, something slower, something more in line with everything we have already seen. It means the balance shifts. And once the balance shifts, everything built upon that balance begins to feel slightly less stable. A fortress still stands, but perhaps with fewer reinforcements. A ruler still governs, but with less confidence. A city still functions, but with a growing awareness that the future may not resemble the past. And this awareness spreads quietly, like a change in weather. Not a storm, not yet. Just a difference in the air, the kind that makes people pause, perhaps, without fully understanding why. Now consider how this change interacts with everything that has come before. All those temporary solutions, all those improvised systems, all those arrangements that were meant to hold things together just long enough. Now they must endure a new kind of pressure. Because it is one thing to manage instability when both sides are roughly balanced. It is another to manage it when one side begins, slowly, to gain momentum. Momentum is a dangerous thing. It encourages movement. It invites ambition. It suggests possibility. And possibility, in politics, is rarely ignored. So, the Christian kingdoms, which had already grown stronger through tribute, through consolidation, through experience, now begin to sense something else. Not just survival, not just resistance, but opportunity. And opportunity changes behavior. It alters decisions. It reshapes priorities. A campaign that might once have been too risky becomes acceptable. A city that might once have been left alone becomes a target. A border that once felt fixed begins to look negotiable. And so movement begins. Not all at once, not in a single sweeping advance, but in a series of actions, campaigns, sieges, negotiations, surrenders, arrangements, always arrangements. Because even now, even with momentum shifting, conquest is not clean. You take a city, what then? The walls are yours, the gates are yours. The symbols of authority change, but inside the walls, everything remains inconveniently complicated. Who stays? Who leaves? Who pays? Who governs? Which laws apply? Which customs survive? Which are replaced? Which are quietly ignored? Which are enforced? With enthusiasm. Which are enforced reluctantly? Which are forgotten entirely? These questions do not wait politely for the next battle. They arrive immediately, and they must be answered, often imperfectly, often temporarily, often in ways that create new problems, which, in time, will also become permanent. So the conquest of cities in the 13th century Córdoba, Seville, Valencia, and others is not simply a story of victory. It is a story of inheritance, of taking control of systems that already exist, of deciding which parts to keep, which to change, which to pretend were always yours, and which to destroy, even if destruction makes life more difficult. Because ideology, when it grows stronger, sometimes demands gestures, visible changes, statements, even when those changes are inconvenient, even when they disrupt functioning systems, even when they remove expertise that will later be missed. This, too, is part of the pattern. A system that works is replaced by a system that feels right. And then, quietly, adjustments begin. Because the new system does not work quite as well. So elements of the old system return. Not always openly, not always acknowledged, but present. Because necessity has a way of surviving. Now, imagine the experience of the people living through this. A city changes hands. There are announcements, perhaps celebrations, perhaps fear, perhaps both. Some leave, some stay, some are told they may. Remain under certain conditions. Conditions that may seem reasonable. For now. Always for now. A Muslim population becomes a tolerated community under Christian rule. Mudejars. They farm, they craft, they pay, they adapt. Because what else is there to do? A Christian ruler, having taken a city, discovers that removing everyone is impractical. There is work to be done, fields to be cultivated, taxes to be collected, systems to be maintained. So people remain. Arrangements are made. Temporary arrangements, which, as we have seen, have a tendency to linger. A church rises where a mosque once stood, or a mosque remains, for now, or both exist, in uneasy proximity. Architecture carries memory longer than policy. Stone is patient. It waits through changes of rule, through declarations, through reforms, through ambitions, and so the city becomes layered. Again, different but not empty, changed but not erased, and the frontier moves, which is, after all, what it has been doing all along. Moving, not like a line drawn with certainty, but like a tide, advancing, pausing, sometimes retreating, sometimes surging forward, always leaving behind traces of what came before. A village abandoned, a town resettled, a charter granted, a privilege extended, a wall repaired, a law written, a law ignored, a memory formed. And through all of this, the same pattern continues. An idea emerges. We must secure this land. A solution is improvised. Grant privileges. Encourage settlement. Offer protection. Reduce taxes. Invite people to live here. And they come. Carefully, reluctantly, because the land is still uncertain, but the incentives are real. So, a settlement grows, a town forms, a community takes shape, and what began as a strategic necessity becomes a place, with identity, with pride, with grievances, with stories, with expectations, with a future that no longer feels temporary, even though, in the larger pattern, everything still is. This is how expansion becomes structure, how victory becomes administration, how conquest becomes daily life. And daily life, as always, continues to refuse simplicity. A farmer still worries about rain. A merchant still worries about price. A family still worries about safety. A ruler still worries about loyalty. And beneath all of it, the memory of instability remains. Because even as one side advances, the habit of uncertainty does not vanish. People who have lived for generations in a shifting world do not suddenly trust permanence. They expect change. They prepare for it. They build for it. They live with one eye on the present and one on the possibility that the present may not last, which, historically speaking, is a very reasonable way to live. There is a simple problem that appears after every victory. It is not dramatic. It does not involve banners or speeches. It arrives quietly, almost awkwardly. After the celebration has faded, you have taken the land. Now, who is going to live on it? This question has a way of ruining the mood, because conquering something is one kind of effort. Keeping it is something else entirely. A city may fall, a fortress may surrender, a region may be claimed, but empty land is not useful. Silent streets do not produce taxes. Abandoned fields do not feed armies. And a frontier without people is not a frontier. It is an invitation. So the rulers of the expanding Christian kingdoms found themselves facing a very practical difficulty. They had land, increasingly large amounts of it, and not nearly enough people willing to live there, which is understandable, because these newly taken regions were not peaceful. They were not settled. They were not secure. They were, in the most literal sense, unfinished. A place where the future had not yet decided what it wanted to be. And that is not a comfortable place to build a life. So how do you convince people to move there, to leave safer regions, to settle near a shifting frontier, to build homes where walls might need to be repaired at short notice, where harvests might be lost, where the memory of conflict is still fresh? You offer them something. Not glory, not destiny. Those are unreliable incentives. You offer them advantage, practical advantage, immediate advantage, the kind that makes a difficult decision feel slightly less foolish. And so, quietly, a solution begins. We will give them privileges, just for now, just to encourage settlement, just until the region becomes stable. And that is how charters are born. Fueros, a word that does not sound particularly exciting, which is perhaps appropriate, because what it represents is not excitement. It is negotiation. A fuero might grant a town certain rights, lower taxes, legal protections, self-governance in some matters, obligations clearly defined, privileges explicitly stated. It is, in essence, a deal. Come here, live here, defend this place, and in return, we will make your life easier than it would be elsewhere, which is a persuasive offer, especially to those who have little to lose, or those who see opportunity where others see risk, or those who are simply tired of being at the bottom of a different system and are willing to try their luck in a new one. So people come, slowly at first, then more. Families, farmers, craftsmen, adventurers, the practical and the desperate, the hopeful and the resigned. They arrive in places that are still uncertain, still exposed, still very much part of a frontier that has not decided where it belongs. And they begin to build houses, workshops, fields, walls, always walls. Because no matter how generous the charter, no matter how attractive the privileges, no one entirely forgets where they are. So the town grows, carefully, defensively, with one eye on opportunity and one eye on the horizon. And the system works, which is, once again, the most dangerous outcome for a temporary solution, because success encourages repetition. More charters are granted, more privileges are offered, more towns are founded or revived. The landscape begins to fill. What was once empty becomes occupied. What was once uncertain becomes less uncertain. Not safe, not entirely, but more lived in, more structured, more resistant to sudden loss. And, with each passing year, the idea that these privileges are temporary becomes less convincing. Because people settle. And once people settle, they develop expectations. A family that has built a life in a frontier town does not think of its rights as a temporary incentive. It thinks of them as earned, as deserved, as part of the natural order. A privilege, granted to attract settlers, becomes a right defended by citizens. A legal exception becomes a local tradition. A temporary arrangement becomes identity. This is one of the quiet transformations that shapes everything that quiet follows. Because now, removing those privileges becomes difficult. Politically, socially, emotionally. People do not like to give up advantages, especially advantages that have been part of their lives for a generation, or two, or three. So the rulers, who once granted these charters out of necessity, now find themselves managing a landscape filled with communities that have strong opinions about what they are entitled to. and those opinions are not easily changed, even by kings. Perhaps, especially not by kings, which creates another layer of complexity, because the very system that made expansion possible now limits control. A town with privileges is easier to populate, harder to govern. A community that feels secure in its rights is more stable, also more resistant, more likely to negotiate, more likely to argue, more likely to insist that what was given once cannot be taken away. And so the frontier fills, not with uniform settlements, but with a patchwork. Each town slightly different, each charter slightly unique, each community shaped by the specific circumstances of its founding, which means that the landscape itself becomes irregular, not just physically, legally, socially, culturally. A king may rule over these lands, but he does not rule over a single system. He rules over many, each with its own expectations, its own privileges, its own habits, its own quiet insistence on being treated as exceptional, which, in a way, they all are, because they were all born from exception, from urgency, from the need to solve a problem that did not have a clean answer. And this pattern does not exist in isolation. It connects to everything else, to the cities we have already seen, to the mixed populations, to the lingering communities, to the systems that were inherited rather than created. Because, as new settlers arrive, they do not always replace those who were there before. Sometimes they live alongside them. Sometimes they take over. Sometimes they integrate. Sometimes they conflict. Often they do all of these things at once. A Muslim population remains in a newly conquered area, becomes part of the system, works the land, maintains skills, pays taxes, adapts. These are the mudejas. Not newcomers, not conquerors, but still present, still necessary, still part of the functioning of the region, which creates another layer of arrangement, another temporary solution, another compromise that may or may not last. Because while the charters promise rights to the new settlers, the reality of the land demands continuity, and continuity often means keeping what already works, even if what already works belongs to a population that is no longer in power. So the system grows more complex, more layered, more difficult to simplify. And this complexity has consequences, because the more layered a system becomes, the harder it is to change quickly, and the more people depend on it, the more resistant it becomes to disruption, which is both a strength and a weakness. It stabilizes, it complicates, it endures, it resists. And through all of this, the same pattern continues to repeat. A problem appears, a solution is improvised, the solution works, the solution persists, the solution becomes part of the structure, and the structure, in time, becomes something no one remembers how to undo. There is a quiet humour in this, not the kind that makes people laugh, the kind that makes people sigh, because so much of what later generations treat as fixed, as natural, as inevitable, began as something much smaller. A practical answer, a temporary measure, a concession to circumstance. And then, slowly, through use, repetition, and the absence of better alternatives, it became the world. And people, as always, learned to live inside it, to defend it, to complain about it, to depend on it, and eventually to forget that it had ever been otherwise. There is a particular kind of strength that does not look like strength. It does not announce itself loudly. It does not win great sweeping victories. It does not expand dramatically or reshape the map in bold, confident strokes. Instead, it does something quieter. It continues, which, in a landscape like Iberia, may be the most difficult thing of all. By the time the 13th century begins to settle into itself, much has changed. Cities have fallen. Frontiers have moved. Privileges have been granted. Communities have reshaped themselves around new realities, and the great structures that once dominated large parts of the peninsula have either fractured or been replaced. Except not entirely. Because in the south, in a region that is not the easiest to reach, not the easiest to dominate, not the easiest to absorb, something remains. A kingdom. Not the largest, not the strongest, but still there. Granada. It is easy, later, to treat Granada as an ending. A final chapter. A last holdout. The thing that must fall so that the story can conclude neatly. But for the people living there, it was not an ending. It was a continuation. And continuation, as we have already seen, has its own demands. Granada survives not because it is unstoppable, but because it understands something. Something that others, perhaps, learned too late. That survival in a shifting world does not always come from resisting change. Sometimes it comes from bending around it, from adjusting, from negotiating, from knowing when to stand firm and when to step aside. This is not a comfortable way to exist. It requires patience. It requires calculation. It requires a willingness to accept arrangements that may feel temporary, uncertain, even humiliating. But it works, at least for a while. Granada becomes, in many ways, a master of this kind of survival. It navigates. It pays tribute when necessary. It negotiates. It plays its neighbours against one another. It uses geography, mountains, distance, complexity, all the things that make conquest difficult. And it does not pretend to be something it is not. This is important, because by this point, the Christian kingdoms to the north are no longer small, uncertain powers. They are organized. They are ambitious. They are capable of sustained campaigns. They have learned how to take land, and, more importantly, how to hold it. Which means that Granada cannot simply resist in the old way. It must adapt. So it does. And in doing so, it becomes something very particular. A state that survives not by winning, but by continuing to exist. Year after year, decade after decade, through negotiation, through payment, through careful management of relationships. It is, in a sense, an expert in the same kind of temporary solutions we have seen before. Only now, the entire kingdom operates this way. Everything is provisional. Everything is calculated. Everything is just enough independence, just enough submission, just enough strength, just enough compromise. And this creates a very specific kind of life. Inside Granada, the world does not feel like it is ending. It feels like it is holding on, holding together, holding its breath, perhaps a little longer than is comfortable. And life continues, as it always does. Markets open, workshops function. Water flows through channels that must be maintained. Gardens are tended. Buildings are repaired. Children are born into a world that has learned how to survive by adjusting itself constantly. There is something almost delicate about it, a balance, not stable, but sustained. And yet, even here, the same pattern continues. Temporary arrangements become expected. Tribute becomes routine. Negotiation becomes habit. And habit becomes identity. A generation grows up thinking this is normal, that a kingdom can exist in this in-between state indefinitely, not fully independent, not fully conquered, something else, something that works until it doesn't. Because outside Granada, things are changing again. The Christian kingdoms are not only expanding, they are consolidating, becoming more unified, more coordinated, more capable of sustained pressure, which is, once again, a familiar development. Fragmentation gives way to structure. Structure creates strength. Strength creates possibility. And possibility invites action. Eventually, not immediately. Nothing in this story is immediate, but eventually. And when that pressure builds, the delicate balance that Granada has maintained begins to strain. Not suddenly, not dramatically. At first, it is just more difficult. Negotiations become tighter. Payments become heavier. Options become fewer. The space for maneuvering narrows. And the system that once allowed survival begins to feel constrained, like a room that has slowly become smaller without anyone quite noticing, until movement becomes awkward, then uncomfortable, then impossible. And still, for a time, the kingdom continues, because that is what it does. It continues. It adapts. It adjusts. It bends, until bending is no longer enough. And then, finally, the long process of pressure resolves itself, not in a single moment, but in a sequence of campaigns, sieges, negotiations, agreements, and, at last, surrender. Granada falls in 1492, which is often presented as an ending. But like all endings in this story, it is less clean than it appears. Because even here, at the moment that seems most definitive, the familiar pattern returns. Promises are made, terms are agreed, protections are offered, religious rights, property rights, conditions designed to ease the transition, to make the end feel less final, temporary assurances, given in a moment of necessity, which is, by now, a very familiar pattern, because temporary solutions have been guiding this entire history. And here, at what looks like the conclusion, they appear again. We will allow this, for now. We will protect this, for now. We will respect this, for now. And once again, people believe. Because belief is necessary. Because the alternative is too uncertain. Because life must continue, even at the edge of change. And so the city does not stop. It does what it has always done. It adapts. There is something very comforting about a promise made at the end of a long struggle. It suggests closure. It suggests that whatever came before has been resolved. That now, finally, things can settle. That people can rest. And after centuries of shifting frontiers, of negotiations, of payments, of adjustments, of living in that narrow space between fear and routine, a promise feels like a kind of mercy. In Granada, when the final surrender was agreed, those promises were carefully shaped, carefully worded. They spoke of protection, of rights, of religion, of property, of continuity. The idea, at least on the surface, was simple. Life would continue. Different rulers, different authority, but the people would remain. Their customs, their faith, their homes, their place in the world. For now, always. In this story. For now. And for a moment, perhaps a brief one. Perhaps longer, depending on where one stood, this seemed possible. Because, as we have seen again and again, systems of coexistence had existed before. Not perfectly, not equally, but they had functioned. People had adapted. Communities had survived. Arrangements had held, even when no one believed they would. So why not again? Why not here? Why not now? But something had changed. Not suddenly. Nothing in this story is sudden. But gradually, quietly, the balance that once made compromise necessary was no longer the same. The pressure that once required negotiation had shifted. And when pressure shifts, behavior follows. A promise made in necessity is not always honored in comfort. At first, the changes are small, subtle, administrative. A new requirement, a new expectation, a new interpretation of an old agreement. Nothing that seems, on its own, like a complete break. Just adjustments. Which is how most transformations begin. A regulation here, a restriction there. A suggestion, perhaps, that certain practices should be reconsidered. A quiet discouragement of visible difference. A preference for uniformity. Not demanded, not yet, just encouraged. And people notice. Of course, they notice. Because people always notice when the ground beneath them begins to shift, even slightly. A community that has been promised protection begins to sense that protection is becoming conditional, that what was guaranteed is now subject to interpretation, that what was allowed yesterday may not be welcomed tomorrow. And so, adaptation begins again. Because adaptation is the only reliable response in a world that does not remain still. Some comply, carefully, quietly. They adjust their behavior. They reduce visibility. They navigate the new expectations. Others resist, sometimes openly, sometimes in ways that are harder to see, holding on to habits, to identity, to memory. Because memory, once formed, is not easily surrendered. And here, the story becomes more delicate, more personal, because we are no longer speaking primarily of armies or kings or territories. We are speaking of households, of families, of individuals making decisions that will shape their lives in ways they cannot fully predict. What does it mean to remain? What does it mean to change? What does it mean to appear to change? These are not questions with simple answers, and they do not arrive all at once. They arrive slowly, through policy, through pressure, through the quiet realization that the conditions under which life was supposed to continue are no longer as stable as they seemed. The Muslim population that remains becomes something else, not immediately, not by declaration alone, but through process, through expectation, through the gradual narrowing of acceptable difference. They are converted, or declared to be converted. Moriscos, a word that carries within it the weight of transformation, and also, perhaps, the uncertainty of that transformation. Because conversion, especially when encouraged rather than chosen, is not always clear, not always complete, not always believed, which introduces another layer of tension, because now identity itself becomes questionable, not fixed, not trusted. A person may outwardly conform and inwardly remember, may participate in the new system while carrying the habits of the old, may speak one language in public and another in private, may observe one set of practices when watched and another when alone. This is not stability. This is adaptation under pressure, and it produces a kind of life that is careful, measured, aware, every action considered, every word weighed, every gesture potentially meaningful. And over time, this tension accumulates, because living between identities is not easy. Living under suspicion is not comfortable. Living within a system that does not fully trust you, even when you comply with it, creates a particular kind of strain, which, inevitably, leads to response, sometimes quiet, sometimes not. Rebellions occur. Crackdowns follow. Policies tighten. Trust diminishes further. And the cycle continues, each step reinforcing the next, each reaction making the following one more likely, until the system that once promised continuity begins to feel like something else entirely, something narrower, something more rigid, something less willing to accommodate difference, which is, perhaps, the final transformation. The long history of negotiated coexistence, of layered identities, of practical compromise, begins to give way to something more uniform, more controlled, more defined. And in that shift, something is lost. Not necessarily peace. Peace had always been complicated, but a certain kind of flexibility, a certain tolerance for contradiction, a certain acceptance that people could live side by side without being made entirely the same. That acceptance had never been perfect, but it had existed. And now, gradually, it begins to disappear. Not in a single act, not in a single decree, but through accumulation, through repetition, through the steady replacement of one set of habits with another, until the world feels different, even if it cannot say exactly when that difference began. And yet, even here, the pattern remains. Temporary solutions, lasting consequences, promises made in one context, broken in another. Systems that seemed stable, revealed to be fragile. And people, always, adapting, adjusting, continuing. Because that is what people do. Even when the world becomes something they no longer entirely recognize, there is a quiet lie in the way history is often remembered. It suggests that when great changes happen, everything changes. That the moment a city falls, life inside it becomes something entirely new. That when a ruler changes, the rhythm of daily life follows immediately. That history moves quickly and people move with it. But the truth is, the day still begins before the sun, even in a city that has changed hands, even in a town that now answers to a different authority, even in a place where the language of power has shifted, where the symbols on the walls are not the same, where the prayers in public spaces sound different. Morning arrives anyway. A woman wakes because she must, not because history demands it, because there is water to be carried, because there is bread to prepare, because children do not understand political transitions, and they will be hungry, regardless of who now claims the city. A man wakes because the animals must be tended, because the field, whether it now belongs to him in law or not, still needs attention. Because if he does not work, nothing grows. And if nothing grows, nothing else matters. This is one of the strangest and most consistent features of long conflicts. Life continues with a kind of stubborn indifference to narrative. Empires shift, authorities change, but the small, repetitive acts that keep people alive refuse to reorganize themselves into something dramatic. They remain necessary, and necessity does not wait for clarity. So imagine a town on the frontier, or what used to be the frontier, which is not the same thing, because the frontier moves. But the people do not always move with it. Sometimes they stay behind, in places that used to be contested and are now something else. Safer, perhaps, or simply quieter, but still shaped by what they were. A house stands. It stood before. It stands now. Its walls repaired more than once. Its roof replaced in sections. Its door reinforced, then relaxed, then reinforced again. Because the memory of danger lingers longer than the danger itself. People remember. They always remember, even when the reason has faded. So doors are still locked a little earlier than necessary. Walls are still checked. Paths are still avoided at certain hours. Because habit survives longer than fear, and fear survives longer than reason. Inside the house, the day unfolds, not according to kings, according to needs. Water first, always water, from a well, from a channel, from a system that may have been built under one ruler, maintained under another, and still functions, because no one has found a better way. And here is another quiet truth. Systems outlive identities. An irrigation channel does not care who governs. It cares whether it is cleared, whether the flow is maintained, whether someone knows how to repair it. And often, the people who know how to repair it are the same people who were there before the last change in power. So they remain because they must, because replacing them is more difficult than tolerating them, because practicality once again defeats purity. And so, in the early morning, someone walks along the edge of a channel, checks the flow, removes debris, adjusts something that was learned not from books, not from laws, but from watching someone else do it years ago, under a different authority, in a different version of the same place. And nothing about that action feels like history. It feels like routine, which is exactly what it is. Now imagine the market. It will open. It always opens. Because a city without a market is a city that is already dying. And markets, perhaps more than anything else, resist clean divisions. They bring people together for reasons that are not noble, but are very effective. Need, profit, exchange. A man selling grain does not ask every buyer for a declaration of identity before agreeing on a price. Or, if he does, he will not remain in business for long. So the market fills. Voices rise. Different languages. Different accents. Some more cautious than before. Some unchanged. Because for many, this is not the first time the city has changed. It may not even be the second. So they adapt. They always adapt. A word adjusted here. A gesture softened there. A habit modified just enough to avoid trouble, not erased. Never fully erased, just managed. This is what daily life becomes. Management of risk, of identity, of visibility. A person learns when to speak, when not to, when to show, when to hide, when to insist, when to yield. These are not decisions made once. They are made constantly, quietly, without ceremony, and often without being noticed by those who do not have to make them. Children grow up in this world, and for them, it is normal. That is the most important part. What feels like instability to one generation becomes ordinary to the next. A boy hears 2 languages in the street. He does not think of it as unusual. A girl sees different styles of dress, different customs, different ways of praying. She does not think of it as conflict. She thinks of it as the world, until someone tells her otherwise, until policy tightens, until expectations narrow, until difference becomes something that must be explained, or justified, or hidden. But before that happens, there is simply life, complicated, layered, uncertain, and entirely ordinary, which is, perhaps, the most difficult thing to understand from a distance. Because when we look back at long periods of conflict, we expect intensity, constant tension, endless drama. But what we find, if we look closely, is repetition, routine, small adjustments, the slow accumulation of habits. A man who checks the road before travelling, not because he expects danger, because he has learned that sometimes it appears. A family that stores a little more than necessary, not because they are afraid, because they remember. A community that celebrates carefully, that speaks cautiously, that lives with a quiet awareness that things can change, because they have and will again. And through all of this, the same pattern continues. A simple idea. We will just do this for now, just to get through this season, just to make things easier, just to avoid trouble, just to survive. And then it becomes habit. And then it becomes normal. And then it becomes the way things are done. Until someone asks why. And no one quite remembers. Because it has always been this way. Except it hasn't. Not really. But memory is not. Precise. It is practical. It keeps what is useful. It lets the rest fade. And so, the long centuries of the Reconquista are not only written in battles and treaties, they are written in mornings, in routines, in habits that formed under pressure and remained after the pressure changed. In people who learned to live in a world that refused to stay the same, and found, somehow, a way to continue anyway. There is a moment, late at night, when everything becomes quieter than it should be. Not silent, never completely silent, but quieter. The kind of quiet that makes small sounds feel larger. A footstep, a shift of wind, the movement of something, unseen beyond the edge of vision, and in a place that has spent centuries learning how not to trust the horizon. That kind of quiet is never entirely comfortable. So someone is awake. There is always someone awake. A man in a watchtower, perhaps, or what used to be a watchtower. Because time changes things, but not always in the way people expect. The tower stands. It was built for a reason, a simple reason. To see, to warn, to survive the night. That was all. Nothing grand, nothing symbolic. Just a practical answer to a very practical problem. There might be raiders. There might be movement. There might be danger coming across the land before dawn. So the tower was built, stone placed upon stone, raised high enough to see beyond the immediate, high enough to give a few extra moments of warning, which, in a world like this, could be the difference between loss and survival. It was never meant to last forever. It was built because it was needed. For now. Just for now. And yet, like so many things in this long story, it remained. Because the need did not disappear. It changed. It shifted. It moved. But it did not vanish. And so the tower continued to stand. Through seasons, through rulers, through wars that came and went, through agreements that held and broke, through generations that forgot why it had first been built, but continued to use it anyway. Because habit is easier than reinvention. Because the structure is already there. Because someone must watch, even if they are no longer entirely sure what they are watching for. So the man in the tower waits. Or someone like him. In one century, he may be watching for riders from the south. In another, for movement from the north. In another, perhaps, he is watching out of routine more than necessity. Because the land has grown quieter, safer, or at least it appears so. And yet, the habit remains. The fire signals, the lines of sight from one tower to another, the understanding that if something is seen, something must be done. These systems, like everything else, began as temporary, emergency measures, improvised responses, a chain of towers, a pattern of watchfulness, a network of awareness stretched across uncertain land. And, over time, they became part of the world. So much so that even when the danger lessened, the structures remained. Because removing them would feel careless, unwise, perhaps even foolish. Better to keep them, just in case. just in case, is one of the most powerful forces in history. It builds, it preserves, it justifies, it lingers, long after the original reason has faded, and so the tower stays, and the man, or someone like him, continues to climb it, continues to look, continues to listen, even when the land below has changed, even when the villages are fuller, even when the roads are busier, even when the great conflicts that once defined the region have settled into something quieter, because the memory of instability does not disappear. It settles. It becomes part of the landscape, part of the mind, part of the way people move through the world. And so, night watch continues. A little longer than necessary. A little more seriously than required. A little more carefully than the present alone would justify. Because the past is still there. Not visible, but present. Like a shadow that remains even after the object has moved. Now, imagine the land beneath that tower. Fields, villages, roads. A town that was once on the edge of danger and is now somewhere further inside. Or perhaps the opposite, because the frontier has shifted many times. And each time it moved, it left behind something. A wall, a habit, a memory, a story, a way of living that made sense when things were uncertain and continued even when certainty tried to take its place. People still check the horizon, even when nothing is there. Still close doors a little earlier. Still speak with a hint of caution in unfamiliar company. Still carry the quiet awareness that things can change. Because they have. Because they did. Because they always might again. And this is perhaps the final shape of the Reconquista. Not a clean victory, not a simple division, but a long conditioning, a way of living shaped by centuries of adjustment, of temporary solutions that became permanent habits, of systems built for survival that remained long after survival became less urgent. The watchtower is not just a structure, it is a memory made of stone, a reminder that once it was necessary to see far, to expect danger, to respond quickly. And even when that necessity fades, the instinct remains. So the man watches, or someone like him, and the land stretches out below, no longer what it once was, but still carrying the traces of everything it has been. Cities that changed hands, but not entirely. Communities that adapted, but did not disappear. Systems that were meant to last a season and endured for generations. Promises made, promises broken. Arrangements formed, arrangements forgotten. And through all of it, life continued. Quietly, stubbornly, without waiting for history to explain itself. The tower stands, because it always has, because it might still be needed, because removing it would feel like forgetting. And forgetting in a place that learned so much from remembering is a risk few are willing to take. So the watch continues, not because it must, because it once did. And that has always been enough.